Hello everyone, today we return to our Renovatio Imperii and the resurgence of Imperial Catholic traditional power in the heart of medieval Europe. In the past weekends we discussed this at some sort of deep level, multiple videos. It's in theory part of a broader episode, right? But such concepts are so fundamental to the understanding of Western civilization that is impossible not to go at this pace, right? So we already evaluated in the previous videos. I will not digress in order to avoid repetitions. The objectivity of this civilization, namely the universal ecumenic standard valid for all peoples in this great corporative hierarchy, dominated by virile spirit, as we know from the entire Catholic theology from pre-Christian and Christian times. And you know what I mean by that. At least if you do, you're in the right circle, so to say. And we see also in the Hermetic tradition and so on, as well as a proper hierarchy, right? A hierarchical body according to the probably mystical corporative, not metaphor, but symbolism of Imperial Catholic tradition, right? There is also another aspect of this, namely the role of man, right? The term humanistic sometimes comes up when we talk about especially the 12th century resurgence in particular. This is mostly modeled on the basis of certain literary achievements that objectively, yes, did bring mankind rather than humanity. There is a radical difference between the two terms, just linguistically and metaphysically, obviously enough. At the center of this resurgence, as obviously the divine genius of such beings, is the leading one in the effort to bridge the gap between God and the lower nature. And there is in this sometimes a misconception regarding not just the humanity of it, but the alleged simplicity, at least the simplicity intended in a modern sense, attached to this mankind, right? Simplex in Latin means something metaphysically very precise, namely something that is more unitarily coherent with its own heavenly double, and that in this sense is less affected by human degeneration, in fact by the fall, right? You have sort of similar visions of this that obviously refer to the idea of a rebooting age, right? So a reactivation ex virtute of, in fact, a renewed imperium achieved through deeds and sort of works and divine grace accordingly, right? So simplicity must be understood as something that is also internally coherent and solid. And so just like the empire, capable of transfiguring towards obviously the upper hand all the peoples that inhabited the same, true, again, always a layered degree of value where sort of the worthier are at the top and the less worthy are at the bottom, and that must strive with one another as well in order to actually strengthen this force. We've seen this happening in Rome before the conquest of the world, with the struggle between the patricians and the plebeians. It is something you feel in the Middle Ages that is actually a less simple system, because naturally it's degenerating. It's part of the Iron Age anyway. It's the Roman Augustan era had been this last glimpse of the Golden Age, prophesied in fact between the Bronze and the Iron one. Nevertheless, it's even more striking, showing you that mankind, in this sense, is supposed to, and capable especially, and this is so important in the divinely transfigurative sense, to re-elevate to that height, right? There isn't a deterministic fall per se. There is an understanding that the lower nature, by its own definition, is becoming, and it tends as such towards the abyss, but it can become also in its own improvement and resurgence at the same time. And so when you look at this quote-unquote Renaissance of the High Middle Ages, you realize that the simplicity of these peoples was not humanistic. Actually, it was anti-humanistic, and proudly so. And the country permeated by the sacred mark of the Renovatio after the collapse of the classical world. So the Roman standard remained the only possible center for the reactivation of the Golden Age. The Roman race had been metaphysically etched as the only possible medium to return to heaven. This is what Holy Roman emperors very deeply understand, embracing properly that metaphysical genetics. They are Romans, right? The Ottonians make explicitly this switch from an institutional point of view. In 13th century German battlefields, the imperials call themselves, properly in their battle cry, as Romans. And admittedly, like, things start eventually falling once again toward the later Middle Ages with the 14th century crisis. Things change in mentality as well. In this sense, never conflate the later Middle Ages with this peak of actually, and greater peak in absolute sense. Like, there is this completely anti-historical and anti-historiographical at this point idea that sort of the later Middle Ages would have been somehow better, like the same Renaissance was somehow even a bigger civilization than the one of the big one of the heart of the Middle Ages. It actually wasn't, right? It's as if the world had, not just Europe, by the way, had to recover from the contraction of the same that wouldn't, in fact, be reachieved in scale up to the later 17th century, as a matter of fact. And among the best vestiges of such renovatio are our Gothic cathedrals, right? That represent, in this sense, not much some like a modern person in secular background would think as, building a skyscraper today, because, matter. There is actually also in positivism, in the industrial age, some sort of substantially traditional meaning to the increase in power, right? That can happen in sort of more titanic ways, sort of less disciplined, closer, and bring properly to the end of the world, self-destruction, etc. But in this sense, the achievement of the Gothic cathedrals, just as much as what you can see from the vestiges of Rome, was not understood in some, again, materialistic sense, or merely as, a random vestige. They needed these structures for some reason, and just we happened to have received from them. This was the proper metaphysical tension orienting mankind in the return toward the origins, and so towards God, not in a merely quote-unquote evolutionary sense, but in a inverted look at the fall and what lay before. Gothic cathedrals with their spires piercing the heavens, and so symbolizing obviously the achievement of heaven themselves. I always say mostly the same thing. I will make at some point a more comprehensive video about the theology of Gothic architecture. Like, what does this building actually signify, right? And we always say it, the idea of a properly metaphysical interior that is meant to reflect the light entering from heaven with an outer shell that represents, in this sense, counterintuitively, the horrors and errors of the world. And so an idea of instead innerly, in the core of the mystery of the symbol, like walls of light, fundamentally, that are immaterial, at least in the lower nature understanding of the saying. Always remember that, of course, at this point, there were exterminating Cathars, and of course, dual Gnosticism does not find any place in Orthodox, in Christian, pre-Christian times as well, and that matter gets transfigured itself as it's one with the spirit, and inextricably so, right? You have this incredible moment in the history of civilization where 80 of these giants sort of start to properly dot the skyline of Western Europe before later the generation shifted, again, potential outward into horizontal scatterings. You can argue, some say, during the age of discoveries, explorations, it's a bit unfair, telling the truth, to attribute to colonial conquest the similarity with the disintegration of an organism through, especially like the idea of a mostly third estate-led mercantile expansion and secular humanism. But a part of that was definitely happening also later. What we see in Western expansion in the post-medieval times, provided that we can actually speak of proper sort of end from a socio-cultural way of the Middle Ages until sometime between the 18th and the 20th century, a real expansion based on a true idea of Western cohesion, regardless of the Reformation. We'll surely pass through those chapters. We have so many videos to make on all these topics from properly a theological and metaphysical point of view. But there is no doubt that what you see expanding, ecumenically speaking, and in a geographical sense, literally so at that point, that yes, may be in the sense beyond the archetype and the metaphysical character of the symbol, but still globally, European power is the fruit of an incredible development of Western civilization in the Middle Ages that sort of acts as some sort of decaying, overburdened atom of some sort, and sending out these energies outside in the moment in which the sort of structure holding it together had been the Societas Christiana, the empire, etc., get contested. You have, countries like England, the Netherlands that had, in that sense, that embedded potential and circumstantially succeed in becoming incredibly powerful and rich, and through surely their mercantilism, their third estate, deeply undermining not just Catholic but also monarchic powers. So there is no doubt there is a modern and secular trail that unfortunately has also further substantiated itself up to this point in history with the greatest amount, in fact, of atheism and in the sense of pushed anti-Westernism, telling you the truth. And that's another point. But whatever stands on its legs and successfully achieves is the fruit of a truly traditional, in this sense, imperial power. And there is no doubt that not just before we said there is another crisis at the end of the Middle Ages, yes, and it is deeply felt and everything, but fundamentally and differently from antiquity, even though we could debate about that too, like medieval civilization does not quite end. Right, what we see in the Renaissance is fundamentally a medieval civilization. There isn't a fracture, there isn't an end, there isn't a sort of what had happened after Rome, with a deeper blending of peoples, of spirits. What we are making this video about, as we've seen in the previous ones, is the reinvigoration of that spent Latin world with Germanic spirit, and so an effervescent alchemy that puts back together certain elementary, as in this sense, primitively simple but traditionally transfiguring elements of European identity. And I would, in this sense, always advise not, in fact, to buy into the notion, well, okay, simply like what we see in any other time in history, especially these later ones, while indeed being morally declining, simply it's at this point, civilization is like this. It's categorically staged at this point where the third estate or the fourth estate dominate. It's but an illusion, right? And this is why medieval history actually shows you the way, because indeed the passage from antiquity to the Middle Ages was always within a fully traditional world. The greater issue that had fundamentally occurred was the split of royal and priestly, so warrior and priestly faculties at large, not even entirely, but importantly, because mankind was not able At this point, we can talk in the Fourth Age, probably of humanity, as a whole, because definitely was a virile establishment. In fact, the regime in the Renovatio, not capable of working anymore at a standard in terms of level of compounded king and priest, which is something actually you see also before Christianity, and in fact happening the gradual decline from the gold to the silver to the Bronze Age, etc. Right? So we could make all a history going back in time and seeing how indeed, according to the highest principle, all civilization is gradually declining, but not because it does not hold in itself. Was it just a matter of life, like existing still, a core of divine power in various manifestations? What happens in the modern age definitely does render justice to certain aspects also of the previous classical and medieval past. Now, historicist interpretations also prove insufficient to grasp the sense of this transformation. We should be able to reason beyond historiographical nets or cages that simply make us think of history in the way we've been fundamentally taught it in the last couple of hundred of years. This is not to say, obviously I speak from the internal side here, that academia is fundamentally undermining, or that our historical knowledge is fundamentally bad. No, and this is exactly what I was just saying before this point, that you should actually study history. And well, we know a lot of incredible things. What, however, came less is a holistic, capacity of synthesis, and in fact of not of abstraction but of theorization, but also of direct observance through the sheer amount of knowledge and correct method, and in this sense lack of ideological prejudice, to the wall of this transformation, right? That what happened, especially in the Middle Ages, we give it for granted. I mean, the most straightforward sort of conventional narrative, if you just talk with some random persons, that the Middle Ages were fundamentally a bad period, right? Still, the idea of the Dark Ages is actually there. You know that as a medievalist, actually, I don't make an overwhelming fuss about this, because it's the cheapest criticism you can make towards people that obviously do not know anything about medieval history and civilization. But that is still there as an idea. I mean, our minds, even when we don't want it, are wired in this sense that the Middle Ages, as we still call them like this, was some strange period that we are supposed to conceive, in fact, in between. And the original humanists who used the term first didn't even fully somehow mean it in the way we mean it today, right? So it shouldn't even be culpabilized for that. But therefore, something that is obviously many people love the Middle Ages, so you can't say that everybody thinks the Middle Ages are bad or Dark Age, absolutely not, but that are still somehow understood as separated from a broader flow. What I was saying before is that you can absolutely debate, especially in the Mediterranean, whether antiquity properly ended in the way we understand, because that's also a modernistic filter that we apply in our explanation of, in fact, the quote-unquote, the Middle Ages, and also antiquity in relation with it, right? And it is indeed wrong for all a series of reasons, that even just knowing medieval literature, what we know, what these people explicitly said, was drawing heavily from antiquity, and which continued throughout all the ancient regime. Like if you visit all, Rococo, neoclassical, but what do you think all those classical mythological references are about in the residences of the aristocracy, of the nobility, etc.? There is a deep traditional concept behind all that. Now, and we understand them mostly as fashions somehow, and we lack in that sense the measure of the tide that medieval civilization really was, as far as the later modern one also was entailed, right? Because we immediately, as I was saying before, associate, even among, if you listen to lots of traditionalists on X, there is a lot of this cosplaying. I think most people, like whichever historical interest they have, they're really cosplaying. They're not really interested in explaining what happened. And namely the fact that, again, there is actually a modern age, right? I personally, as a medievalist, think much more that there was an actual Middle Age of some sort, or at least something that continues as a long wave up to almost our era, and that the actually most contentious creation and self-promotingly scammy sort of era was historiographically crammed on us. In fact, is the idea, the existence of a modern age. Like modern age, if you think about it, yes, there are some aspects that fit, like some factors, some criteria, some standards for which you can obviously conceive a modern age. I use the term myself, but it's actually the feeblest of them all. Right, it makes much more sense considering the Middle Ages and then the contemporary era, basically. I know that I come from a country that uses the term contemporary and modern in very different ways compared to mostly Anglo-American, and so the majority of my followers here, sort of education, academia. Nevertheless, the point being, as I said before, essentially a traditional and a post-traditional society. And so also in the passage between Antiquity and the Middle Ages, there is a much smoother, right, continuity than we also tend to overly dramatize, right, in many ways. But what constitutes that long tide that still lives in the hearts and souls, especially of the ancien regime. I can say even the nobility, the aristocracy. It's truly the entire hierarchy, the entire system as such, up until, again, depending on which parts of Europe you think about, from essentially the 1792 to 1918. Right, let's put it this way. And that, in fact, we're still incredibly close to, if you think about it. So one aspect that especially I wanted to point out in this episode and in its multiple videos is art, is iconography and the symbolism of the same. Where we have, in fact, medievally speaking, I use a lot of beautiful medieval art in my imagery on Schwerpunkt. I also on X, I try to show that in many ways. And it's a level of art that does not get celebrated in the properest way. I mean, everybody can't post the picture of a medieval cathedral and simply say, "Oh, look what the Europeans did." Okay, that's better than nothing. But let's say in a deeper sense, like, do you understand what's the meaning of sacred art, right? When you look at sort of a painting, even of the Renaissance, can you spot the classical motive, not just in style, but in deeply embedded metaphysical meaning? If you look at the Botticelli, according to you, what are you looking at, if not a divine transfiguration? And the saying goes for the entire medieval art that I would also regionalize in extremely specific ways. Personally, I think that medieval Italian art is something successfully maintaining what I've also been pretty vocal about concerning the continuity of Romanity in the Latin-Germanic world, that level of Imperial Catholic traditional excellence that you do not actually find in Byzantine art either, and that was already somehow more sclerotic and or drawing from a specifically different view of civilization, that indeed also because of Hellenic and Hellenistic legacy was of that sort of older Dorian mold, but in fact coming to sclerotize a bit earlier than what the Romans did. And in that sense, the Roman emperors we're talking about also in Constantinople as well as in the forests of Germany. And as such, we shouldn't be surprised to look at the symbols and to sort of probably reacquire the immediate connection with them. Like if you look at Christian art, sacred art, which is the same, obviously, considered in the Byzantine Empire, that was, in that sense, a bit more regulatory from an iconographic point of view. As you know, there wasn't even something considered as Roman that was not sacred, right? For example, and there are some, I think, mentally dysfunctional people, because you find online this kind of weird Reddit criticism of my work. I think somewhere, somebody claimed that I said that there was no such thing like anything but sacred music, for example, in the Byzantine Empire. Well, yes, in the sense that the imperial authority and the Byzantine Church counted as Roman, and in the sense Christian, because the concept was indestructible at that point, only sacred art. So there wasn't technically anything that was Byzantine in this sort of more institutional sense of the term that could be outside of the realm of the sacred. And it's obvious that the Byzantines had a lot of art and music and styles, and that also this came from also as influences from many other places as well, and that they influenced themselves other countries. But in this sense, the idea of the double, the idea of a higher nature, where this sort of sacred transfigurational concept applying to the empire and the church together is separated from the rest, is speaking in itself, like in this case of medieval civilization, very well what the mentality of these people was about, right? But what we see in the West, and that we concentrate in this episode, is the most striking resurgence, the one that will in fact overwhelm the same Byzantine Empire and will basically take over the entire Western Eurasia in terms of spiritual hierarchy and authority. Like if you look in terms of everything, like of political, of financial, everything revolved around Western Eurasia. This was by far the biggest civilization in starting properly from the High Middle Ages, and as I've explained actually in many videos, at that point, truly in an hegemonic direction, so fully surpass, being able to overwhelm the others. But that I've always stressed, like if you took even just Gaul and Italy alone, summed together, like those were two regions that are by scale entirely competitive with, for example, the Byzantine Empire alone, right? And I made some pretty thorough video analysis of this, and we'll keep talking about it because, again, the myth of Latin-Germanic backwardness is one of the hardest to die in absolute terms. It's paradoxically filtered, again, by that sort of modernistic self-hatred regarding the Dark Ages and whatever, and it does not, it very often sort of reflects a provincialistic kind of attitude towards the Middle Ages as just some strange puzzle of different countries that eventually came to differently influence also the historiographical and overall view of the Middle Ages, and that often don't take into account how much of a radical continuity existed in Western civilization from Roman times in the West. Like if there was a shrink or whatever, this was happening actually also in the East. It was happening also in the Islamic world. It's not something that as we've been too often portrayed, like, I don't know, the Eastern civilization was booming and the Western Europeans were living in huts, right? They were as, if not often, more advanced in many circumstances, and surely starting at the very latest from the 12th century to surpass the other civilization. And not because they had been inferior up to that point, they had remained absolutely comparable. But this is not what I'm going to discuss because I already addressed sort of the early medieval part of this, not just in other videos, but in part of the ones of the same episode we're discussing here. But the art, if you look at, again, the same sort of Western art throughout, was it even the Book of Kelts? If you had to look at the Celtic fringe in the High Middle Ages, as opposed to, I don't know, to the peak of the Roman Catholic Curia in the 13th century, that expresses this vitality, this blood, this lymph that is golden and purple at the same time, just like life, just like blood spurts, and that hematophilic, in this sense, truly God-loving and self-sacrificial, in this sense, warlike, sort of metaphysically warlike, struggle-oriented Western civilization that struggles and wins, right, in this effort. And let's start from these artistic aspects, and we'll draw parallelisms here also with ancient theology and more. But the crucifix, which is, a symbol that in and of itself calls for reflection, no matter how you see any matter whatsoever. The crucifix that became the Lord, right? There was always the Lord since the beginning of Christianity. And that I also made a video explaining being actually, in this sense, a quite specific metaphysical symbol, shifting the bar of earth towards heaven, as opposed to, say, Thor's hammer or the same battle axe of the Romans, the fasces of the lictores, and that are actually the same symbol. When I made that video, many people said, "Oh, but what does the Christian cross have to do with the lictorian fasces, etc.?" again, if you have an idea of what solar symbols were, what properly the idea of the intersection between heaven and earth is the doctrine of, again, the two natures of being and becoming, the role of sacred royalty and how it struggles in the space that is sort of distant from man and God, etc. You know what those symbols mean. But you think that, I don't know, the ancients had the fasces for no reason, or that the crucifixes happened to be there just because, Christ was nailed on it. I don't understand how people can be so superficial. We do live in a modern secular world, so it's obvious that people are neurocognitively wired to non-thinking. But if you have even a basic idea where sort of Christianity from a theological and historical religious standpoint comes from, how it differs also from sort of the Judaic creed, and how sort of also the influences that arrive from the broader East, including the Indo-European, well, do you realize what these symbols really are, or do you live by X memes, right? I make videos on this stuff, so nobody can accuse me of not having explained this, but this is the point. If you have no idea of what I'm talking about, go check my videos. Don't be spoon-fed by the algorithm like a child, right? YouTube is hiding you my work, and you don't even know what I've done, right? So if you have questions before posing them, which I encourage you to do anyway, give me food for thought in Q&As, because those are also really interesting as a video type. Go check my playlist. There is an entire history of theology one, there is history of Christianity, there's Imperial Catholic tradition, there's ancient religion, Roman religion. We'll extend on many. We covered almost all Indo-European ones, and so on. In any case, let's talk about this. The crucifix, right? The crucifix, I said before, it becomes the Lord, not in the sense it had never been, right? It had always been. However, what you see in Gothic art, what you see in the heart of the Western High Middle Ages, is the reaffirmation, in that sense, of the power of the Lord as a true incarnated God and King, right? This is the same vision that, I don't know, the Merovingian rulers or the Capetian ones had of themselves, right? Of a Philip II Augustus that officiates the Mass on the battlefield of Bouvines and takes over eventually medieval Europe with French civilization, substituting the same Holy Roman Empire at a point in sharing actually that same level. We're an institutional, like two different things. Holy Roman Empire in France, it's two different things. The French couldn't be sacred. Why? Why not? Like, who decides this? Just in a modern secular idea, you would think, having come from all the anti-clerical and anti-religious vibe of the 18th, the 19th, and 20th century, that, I don't know, a French king was inherently, couldn't be. First of all, an emperor, because technically a Holy Roman Emperor is not, again, a guy that lives in those boundaries of Germany, Bohemia, Italy, Burgundy, etc., and it ends there. It's something that we are habituated to think. Any Christian ruler could be the Holy Roman Emperor, not even a Holy Roman Emperor. And the French definitely go very close to that. What is Christian sainthood to you? Why was, according to you, Louis IX a saint, as also a crusader, knight, commander, warrior, and so on? Like, there is a reason for the way these people conceived the virile figure of the Lord who self-sacrifices, right? For some reason, you still have so-called Edens that claim that it has nothing to do with Odin, who actually hanged himself to get the sacred, meaning of the runes and the secret of the afterlife. What does it mean? Aside from the fact that it's not even just a coincidence, like there's plenty of mythologies and theologies where this actually happens, and the self-sacrificial aspect is properly encoded in the entirety of theological language in all of these religions. But according to you, what is that? It's, Odin just one day wanted to, I don't know, the Germans at some point sat down and made up the story for no reason, or it has no connection with a Christian one as well. In not meaning that it derived from that. Again, they all derived from millennia-old beliefs. But again, how does it work to you? These are just some random things. Like, I'm sorry if you are there, by the way, for not talking about the the soul of chivalry, the Madonna with the new virginal traits emphasizing purity and intercession, right? The list is long here. This is the symbolism of the Virgin, including the one of Immaculate Conception. People often say, oh, but there is actually written, it's a mistranslation because they translated sort of young girl as a virgin or whatever. The Immaculate Conception is pretty much everywhere in classical antiquity. You may not notice, and I made an entire video about this, but we'll come back on the specific references. But the idea of sort of the man-god hero that wins over death and is in this sense father, husband, and son of the Virgin, this is very explicit in Hermetic tradition, is the restored, like the, in fact, repristinated, the renovated symbol of the water, of the abyss, of femininity, of darkness, that is restored into an angel-like woman, a Victoria, a Nike, a Philcia, a Valkyrie, right? This is every freaking where, all right, in the entire world. And if you don't understand that, if you don't know what the Virgin standing on the crescent, for example, means, I have some Catholic friends, by the way, I never openly said I'm Christian, I'm Catholic. I've always maintained this mystery to challenge you as well, that literally do not know. I think that the Virgin standing on the crescent is just in our later modern European tradition, obviously the symbol of Christianity defeating the Ottomans. But that symbolism is incredibly old, and it is, say, and we talk about this in the video about the Olympians. It's Artemis, so that is actually an Olympian. It's an Apollonian deity, even though she's the goddess of the forest, she's the lady of the forest, tree of life, but is in the symbol of the moon that is transfigured in her shining. And so truly as the darkest symbol of femininity, of the element that represents the lower nature, right? A counterposed to the higher heavenly, in the sense Uranian, Apollonian symbol of virility, gets possessed, tainted, and transfigured, and becomes the same transfigured soul of the hero that defeats his own humanity, mortality, materiality, chthonic symbolism, that is the symbol of the woman and sort of the prostitute of Babylon and so on, into the Virgin, the restored, the heavenly maiden, right? The prize also of any knight falling in holy war in heaven. All right, that is at the same time the ego, the ego of the warrior, the same virility, the same sword, right, that accompanies it. We're just mentioning it in the other day's video about medieval, Renaissance cavalry, as far as later medieval tournaments were admittedly entail. Like, do you realize that in medieval tournament, how knights were introduced, especially a 15th century tradition introduced in the joust? The knight was not there. The horse was with his lady, carrying also in that sense, accompanied by the servant, the squire, with the helm and in that sense the coat of arms, the emblem of the knight, and the lady was meant also in that sense to represent the transfigured soul of the hero, and she wore the clothes stained in blood from after the tournament of her own men. If you don't know this stuff, if you're not aware of the golden bow, which is also, as you know, anthropologically a very famous story in the 20s, that doesn't matter how despoiled in part from the original meaning, that there are deep studies of this. The mistress of the forest, and they're the king that has to grasp properly the golden apple, and after having rejuvenated, having given new lymph, new life, by ingravitating the woman. You don't know much about what it means to be a Westerner. Actually, you're not a Westerner at all. Let's be honest about this. I also explained this in the video about the myth of the slumbering monarchs in medieval German folklore that was also pretty much present everywhere across also the Roman Empire, pre-Roman Europe, etc. Every single where, I mean. And so if you're not aware of this, to you, medieval civilization cannot have any meaning, right? According to you, why does the armed Saint George is a knight battling the dragon like Siegfried did, right, in Norse epos, right? Sigurd, if you prefer. And I made a video about St. George's iconography before he was St. George and actually the Indo-European equestrian hero, winning over Death and the Serpent and the Snake and so on. Just like, does it remind you of something? While necessitating the venom of the snake to sort of fortify oneself. This is a parallelism that is notoriously found in the Bible. And some mystical fascists tried to equate this to Christ, just being a chthonic figure with a donkey and, claiming to be probably the snake staff of Moses. They failed recognizing what they were expounding themselves in otherwise largely correct fashion just because of their own rabid anti-Judaism and attempt at framing Christianity as essentially a Semitic cult of some sort that was incoherent with a broader Imperial Catholic traditional, in this sense, hegemonic Imperial Catholic traditional beliefs across all the world universally at the time. Right, but I made that video again about the essentially 3rd century BC trace, lower Danube. That's where the later iconography of St. George as a meme that will be repeated for millennia originated. Right, the same identical one. Right, the hero slaying the dragon, and that we know. Obviously, we know also roughly the mythologies of those peoples from many other sources and evidence as a whole, even from later sources about how these peoples all believed again in the same concepts. But it's obvious, in fact, that these things existed way before the 3rd century BC, and the passage to some sort of more contemplative, naturalistic kind of endeavors and activity with the establishment of art and this kind of symbolism is something that only gradually happens to different populations. So these symbols altogether, as they prepotently resurge in the affirmation of the superiority of Western civilization over the world, express the reemergence of an ancient vision as well, in a truly providential sense, because this meant to, not to quote-unquote simply predict the future, but to sort of know how the future would go as in a divine vision, because this is the same divine vision that molds the world in its own image, right? Just like Alexander conquering the world and turn it Hellenistic, and for not talking about the Caesars and the Augusti of the great ecumenic empire of Rome. But here we are seeing again the reemergence of this awareness, right? And that all of these elements are complete sort of whole in their respective theological function within the interiority of the European stock, right? We should be reaffirmed in this sense that aside from people fixating at this point racially on how much, step pastoralist admixture do you have in your DNA, like, Europeans are fundamentally very similar among one another. There are important divides, granted, but there is actually a very significant ethnic homogeneity. If you look at the sort of the broader expanse of European character and history, etc., you could say, I don't know, that these are divides that are eventually civilizationally territorialized, right? There is probably a core of Western civilization and then a fringe as such. And this often is misportrayed and depending on the sympathies. But if you concentrate on also the wholeness of this, and especially its projectional capacities and this immense core mass that overflew, like all across, like truly informing the world in its own image, you can really realize how powerful the Middle Ages were on the basis of these ideas. Right. This is essentially as a resurgence, and we've seen it in the video about the Dorian invasions that, as you know, are historiographically contested as a concept because, and we have explained why, it's mostly ideologism. There is actually nothing controversial in stating the obvious that, of course, everything happens by degree, but degrees of something that actually existed and that can't be denied in this regard. As the Homeric Apollo and Athena had emerged from the Doric-Mycenaean crucible of Bronze Age warrior culture. And the maiden Artemis that we just mentioned as Diana had surfaced against the maternal Artemis of earlier Anatolian cults as well. This is incredibly important because you can definitely see that tendency. You can see that in late antiquity. You can see it in that sense in the sort of increasing mixture with sort of a broader sort of Levantine influx that surely carried with itself like a different moral tendency, to say the least, and would have gradually re-overwhelmed Europe as it had happened before the Indo-European migrations. Well, in all these times in history, we can routinely see this incredibly prepotent coming back. We've seen it for the Dorians, we've seen it for the Italics, and at this point, this is the times of the Germans, and in this sense of the Romano-Germanic civilization, the imperial ecclesiastical one that reemerges in the West along this inseparable axis, right, in a way that had actually failed to succeed in Constantinople due to a church that was too subjugated to an autocratic rule and could not therefore act as a counter and as a strengthener of the same imperial rule, nor in the Islamic world that actually denied the existence of a sort of royal and priestly split, and obviously could not match what humanity was arrived at the time. In fact, penalty, as you know, a radical instability throughout all the Middle Ages, and as soon as basically the caliphs had overstretched basically from the Atlantic to Central Asia. Right, and this is, again, incredibly relevant, important, because it's not merely a sort of simple sort of washing of the previous temper, but it's a syncresis with the same. This is the same that had manifested in the moment the Indo-European world had gradually infiltrated and taken over, right, as a non-majority, as a matter of fact, but still a moral one in especially in the more developed parts of Europe that had been the most influenced by the civilization of the mother, right? And so this is an incredibly important phase. You have, just like in the fading of the Mycenaean world, parallel to the one of later Romanity, the injection of new elements, right, from Central Europe, from the Nordic world. You have the Dorians that carry, in the sense that evangelic presence and fable into the very heart of what will become classical Hellas, and that we consider as a pillar of Western civilization, just as much the Germans brought into the exhausted Latin world in a moment of great troubles for everybody involved, for that matter, this new idea of a less statally dependent but still power-achieving imperial faculty that will relieve still with the Sol Invictus that Frederick II of Hohenstaufen identified with in official titling at the same level of the Rome of the Caesars, right? So this passage is much more crucial than probably most of other historical events, right? You can look at this scarcely actually in the way it happened in other parts of Asia, for example. The influences there come also from peoples that were obviously capable and powerful in their own regard, but the continuity also in an ethnic sense within Europe, and the capacity to withstand also steppe onslaughts, to reconstitute, to actually maintain alive the Holy Roman Imperial Catholic Apostolic leadership of the universe. It's something you don't quite see in China in the same way. China has, even there, a more sclerotic world that gets routinely refilled also by rulers of Turkic, Mongolian stock, and that, in the sense, work over a power base that is truly the one of a great military civilization, but not quite, in fact, in the longer run with the explosive power that Europeans will have in later history. Now, there is yet another interesting aspect that is unavoidable as far as the Middle Ages are concerned, and we will see this in dedicated, specialized videos. This episode wants to be a great recap in several videos, but it's important to pass through certain concepts, at least, that we at times just hinted at and we can see from a different perspective. So, up to the Franco-Carolingian epoch, the Germanic world had stood beside, let's put it in this way, the later forms of priestly consecration, right? At least there is an idea, which I don't think is really suffragated by much evidence, that however the church had overstepped in the relation with emperors, and to the point of the latter essentially bowing to the church itself. This is surely true, right? There are many events of this. This is not even just a matter of the papacy. It's also, think about Ambrose of Milan towards Theodosius. There is definitely an understanding that this great shift, this great paradigm shift of late antiquity towards a world that must reevaluate, in this sense, in a more radical sense, the deeper spiritual purpose of imperial enactment, right? In the face of the decline, in fact, of the ecumenic empire, it's something relatively alien to populations coming from Central, Northern, Eastern Europe that had historically actually lurked in the shadows, had constituted themselves the tectonic element of the great Catholic civilization, with Rome, obviously, and her legions controlling quite widely for hundreds of kilometers, people who lived across the frontiers as well. And these peoples, in their warlikeness as tribesmen that couldn't, in fact, constitute some more stable civilizations due to the lack of surplus, and therefore maintaining more actively standing the warlike enactment, right, of power, and eventually breaking through morally, because you can't see, there wasn't a reason like why the Roman Empire had to fall if you consider that it was actually more powerful, it was actually richer, whatever. So there is something that ends up being largely syncretic. Like the Germans do not arrive and substitute themselves to the Romans. On the contrary, there's a deep hierarchical integration in this. There is also an horizontal blend. Like if you look at the Carolingians, they are the Pipinid Arno things for a reason. They stem exactly from a comital and episcopal dynasty that was understood, by the way, episcopally as sort of involved in warfare, especially in the Transalpine War, admittedly, but that pretty much across the entire Europe, like from Germany to Spain, from France to Italy, from Scandinavia, all across. Like you have warrior bishops in the Middle Ages were tolerated, right, and that actually had even a duty in participating to certain military expeditions. And so the idea is that the Germans, broadly meant, had remained more distrusting towards the idea of sort of imperial condescendence to priestly sort of censorship, so to say, in the positive sense of the term, like some sort of evaluation of advice, of authority, of guidance. And that they saw actually the church subordinated to imperial rule, because they considered, when we say imperial here, we mean also it can be royal, right, as far as they were concerned, before, especially before Charlemagne. But don't think there that even titles are that sort of binding, like regnum, imperium are, by the way, Latin terms. The Germans had their own way of doing things that did definitely contemplate an idea of sacred royalty. And this is very well chanted also by the late Gallo-Roman encomiasts, also towards figures like Clovis, that very much embraced the myth of the passion and blood spilling, that recall of human sacrifice, of the sacrifice of the blood, the cult of the blood of ancestry, and this capacity of winning immortality in holy combat, right? So there is something deeply sacrificial even in Clovis's conversion, right? As he was losing at the Battle of Tolbiac against the Alemanni in the Legion. And so this war was truly Romano-Germanic. It wasn't this reactivation of Western civilization does not actually happen in the Germanic world. It happens actually in the Roman world, and dominated by a German establishment. It, interestingly enough, in fact, happens again also in Central Europe, in a truly Germanic world, but already Christianized and conquered by the same Carolingians back in the day. If you look at their classical attribution of Renovatio Imperii to especially the Ottonians, because again we decided that the whole Roman Empire is born fundamentally with Otto the First imperial crowning, but technically there is no difference whatsoever between this and what Charlemagne or even Augustus, for that matter, would believe in line of principle, right? In the sum of this priestly and warrior power in a totalizing ecumenic sense, regardless of how all these actors would have seen it. I mean, not even a Constantine would have likely accepted like a deal like the one between Charlemagne and the papacy, at least not in his condition, right? History goes on and changes. But in this sense, doesn't even necessarily change for the wars. In fact, Charlemagne not just fulfills the vision of Clovis as far as a truly Roman Empire in the Mediterranean, ruled by the Franks, right, was concerned, but also lays the foundation for the same West that will, again, overwhelm the same creation of Constantine, right? And in the sign of the cross, in the city of the holy urbs of Rome, that in fact the Byzantines had not been able to control, and that even in this overwhelming Western power, in fact, the papacy sparks for spiritual ascendancy and hegemony and universal recognition by maintaining its own metaphysical primate over the emperor, in fact, having the Patrimonium Sancti Petri not technically belonging to the Holy Roman Empire or any other earthly dominion, because the Church of Rome belongs to God, right? And from it depend all the other churches. So this is deeply important. This is perhaps like the single most important dynamic of medieval civilization. I mean, there is no doubt, as a matter of fact. And as you understand, it easily straddles multiple eras, not just because the Holy Roman Empire was suppressed by Napoleon, but because the papacy still exists today, and in any case, it derives, again, its veritable title from the one of the pontiff as bridge maker that was attributed to the same Romulus. So who does not see this continuum is woefully ignorant and or malicious, perniciously malicious about it, because the modern thing, it's typical of the modern secular thinking, wanting to demythologize, to desecrate, and to attribute to a mechanism of mere coping, like correspondences of metaphysical and theological foundations in the history of mankind, right? To them, all this message was clear. Right, it wasn't somebody that at a point in Charlemagne's time had to evaluate what it had meant for Rome to be Rome, or the empire to be recognized as such, or the church to have that role. This was sort of negotiated, considering the potential of the two earthly instantiation of the same. But both papacy and empire actually share with one another temporal and spiritual power. The imperium could not come in any other way. In fact, when you look at the quarrel between Philip IV, Philip the Fair of France, and Pope Boniface VIII, Pope Caetani, at the beginning of the 14th century, that's not a degeneration of traditional principle. That's actually the very peak of medieval civilization and the obvious recognition in times of, in fact, of dramatic universal, of the two universal powers, so to say, that technically, like if you are the Pope and you rule over the church and you have this power of, you have armies and you can wage war, you're inherently obviously having a temporal power And this was recognized in part by the same patrimonium, by the deals with Charlemagne, with Pippin the Short, that had brought, in fact, to the Frankish conquest of Italy. There is an interesting dispute, as you know, depending on different varying traditions, regarding first of all, the general ambiguity that the Franks initially had towards the Church of Rome, not because of sort of simple distrust, but because of the obvious implications that the Frankish stepping into Italy had in the relation with the Byzantine Empire. In fact, Rome, in all this, remained not merely a Western, sort of spiritually hegemonic Western authority, but truly an ecumenic, universal one. Rome was, in line of principle, again, not belonging, like in a papal sense, to any power, but they thought to be sort of equally controlling and directing the actions of both Eastern and Western emperors, right? This is a topic that we will talk about in another circumstance. The Franks and Rome had brokered, again, the fact this renovation of the empire that entailed taking over lands that up to relatively short time before had been taken over by the Longobards from the Byzantines that still ruled in some parts of the peninsula. So this was no joke, right? It happened also in other parts of Europe, like, for example, in the Slavic lands, and there were other issues, right, concerning the sort of the stabilization of this power, right? The Carolingians were incredibly careful with the Italic ground. They elevated at the same level of the Franks, differently from any other population they subjugated, and they associated, more importantly, the imperial crown to the Kingdom of Italy, right? They renamed it from Kingdom of the Longobards to King of Italy to sort of dilute a bit, like, you know, that national vibe that could help like some local resurgence. This was definitely the most precious of the various lands in an international sense, even though the manpower and imperial force of the Franks led in the north, roughly in today's northeastern France and Belgium. The spiritual heart of the world laid in the urbs. And there are this, as you understand, for each of these statements and digressions, we could make an entire video. And in part, we already did that, right? But in this sense, there could have been even a change. Like, you could have thought, well, I don't know, the Franks could have simply decided that they would crown themselves emperors of the Romans by themselves. After all, this concept that there was a Roman people that the Germans at some point had come to rule over was pretty much present everywhere. It was not just an archetypal dichotomy between that north and south, but literally the same Longobards in Italy legislated also for practical reasons when they conquered, in fact, the exarchate, etc., like in terms of, you know, their own kings being kings of the Longobards and of the Romans, or protector of the Romans, because that was that well, they were actually the same people in that case, but juridically, because that's what made, in administrative terms, like these laws important. Like, those guys responded to Latin law, right? Whereas most of Italy at this point responded to the Longobards one. And so, as you know, there are very interesting ethnic intersections as far as what does it mean. They understood the concept of the double, right? In being truly Roman emperors, for example, even as Saxon rulers, right, or the same Liutprand of Cremona that may have had also some heavy Germanic ancestry, but was fundamentally an Italian at that point, and specifically differentiating, in fact, between the Longobards, the Franks, the Burgundians, etc., from one side, and the Byzantines as Romans that are also somehow insulted. And this may seem ironic, again, because the most Roman country ever was Italy itself, still, by any sort of ethnocultural mean. But the relation with the empire, in the sense, is the most important one. It's not a horizontal divide. It's not merely a legal thing. It is about who controls the world, right? And there is a misconception in the debate that sees, in fact, from the respective sides, like the claim that Charlemagne would have crowned himself as opposed to being crowned by the Pope and vice versa. Actually, we understand, like historiographically speaking, that it was the Pope who crowned him. And this makes sense because not just the Pope crowned him, but eventually the Roman people present in St. Peter's Basilica. And I always tell you, if you visit St. Peter, when you enter, obviously the church is different from what it was at the time, but there still is the porphyred circle over which Charlemagne kneeled, right? It's not a legend. And nobody knows that, right? There is no sign, whatever. People walk by it, they have no clue. That's where it happened. And then he was, by the same ritual that was eventually to be performed at every imperial coronation, being it void in a Roman sense, the Roman people's acclamation and therefore recognition of the emperor. And in that, so we're talking the Roman people here in the form also of the local Senate that definitely continued existing in the Middle Ages, at least in very different forms. But here we're talking about the Roman nobility that was also, incredibly self-aware throughout the entirety of the Middle Ages regarding the centrality of this power, and especially at this time. And that, in this sense, shows you surely there is a church, an ecclesiastical preeminence, and part of the reason is that this was happening in a church to begin with, but obviously this was also a secular space, like the temporal and the spiritual obviously intersect, and the Roman people is secular power, right? It's temporal power. The church is the spiritual one, the ecclesiastical one, right? And so what you have here with the papal crowning, and in this sense the Roman crowning, right, as a true Germanic leader, like chanted in arms by the local noblemen who bore sword and so on, representing that priestly and warrior unity that was required properly in order to be a holy Roman emperor. And again, we say Holy Roman Emperor because that's also an institutional name to remain later, but this was truly like a Holy Roman Empire, right? It was the same empire. It was not a new version with the Holy before. The empire was Sanctus also in classical antiquity, for that matter. If you know what apostolic means, just for example, like that's also pretty radical Trinitarian concept. These people truly believed in imperium descending with its winged glory on the victorious leaders that had managed, in fact, to conquer an empire of shocking proportions that nobody had seen since the dissolution of the West, and bigger even at the time of Charlemagne at this point in history. And so we know that this procedure happened, but interestingly enough, at that point, still, and this is true also under Louis the Pious, also crowned Lothair, for example, that even though there was an ambiguity in this sense regarding who would sort of crown, recognize, etc., co-ruler, etc., eventually the papal intervention was maintained, and at the same time the Pope at times did actually kneel in front of the emperor, because it was understood that recognition was plenary in the form of like an earthly ruler that was therefore not substituting himself to a merely spiritual one, but was receiving the same spiritual ghost, like the same spiritual form from the same Pope, that at that point recognized that plenitude that the emperor could always fall from, like if he was unworthy of the same. Like you know very well what ancient Persians, for example, thought about Wu said lies, right, as far as the winged glory departing from them, right? So regardless of ambiguities and uncertainties, we know much better what started happening from in the later centuries in the forms, right, that will more habitually pose the emperor and the papacy in also more sort of conflictual ways. This would happen especially since the times of the Gregorian reforms, Before this time, indeed, there was a continuity with earlier traditional forms where sovereigns in many civilizations held a direct divine mandate without mediating priestly investiture imposing subordination. Yet not at this point in history plenarily anymore. In fact, if you even look, this is not even just for the people who like to oppose the terrible Christianity of the South, where, the Nordic purity. If you read, I don't know, the Landnama book, if you have an idea of how sort of Norse society function, you do know very well, aside from the fact that these were sort of essentially fringe societies, and so they were sort of barely connected here with the more ecumenic rule, etc. But there always was, in their own microcosm, the obvious reality of a priestly power limiting land grabbing, for example. It was a societal control over power abuse, right? And this is what the church, at the end of the day, ever since its inception, had fundamentally been. The Gospels are quite clear. There is not a denial of imperial power. There is the realization that who rules on this earth rules as such because he is evenly gifted by the imperium that always comes exclusively from God by merit. This is something you don't find in Islam, right? There is no real, there is a crowning of merit, but the actual merit is only God's, in the sense that there is no incarnation, there's no theosis, there is not like a divinization of the actual ruler. In the West, we maintain this within properly Christianity and the previous traditions, right? So what we have, even in the power, the temporal power of the church, is an admonishment. I always think about this when you pass by a church, that there is a power so great that as long as the world exists, by definition, it means that you, as an emperor, haven't been able to transfigure it, to achieve it, right, in order to transfigure the world into a heavenly reality, right? And so that serves as, remember that you are limited, right? And you are not limited because somebody limits you or because you're inherently faulty per se. Always remember that original sin is not a stamp on you and you go by that. You're actively sinning. Original sin is not a superstition. It is your active want of fear, your actual wanting of fear and death, of mortality, right? We are mortal just because we are afraid of death. And this is a sin that perpetuates itself because it lives in our own flesh in the moment in which also spiritually we go along with it. Because otherwise, as in that sense, in a Christian key, Christ showed, given that he transfigured his human nature as well and saved his human nature. This wasn't, again, saved by God. This is what more like in a Judaic tradition you would think. Christ is not losing and is vindicated by God and yay, he is resurrected. He actually wins himself as a person. This is incredibly important, as you understand, in his human and divine nature that actually are present in potential in every being, right? At least if you look at how everything descends from the one. And so this aspect, this ambiguity in the affirmation of the Holy Roman Empire in the West, in the cooperation at the end of the day, because initially it happens without too much issue. Like an investiture controversy is something that just happens much later in time. And because of powers that were truly earthly and greater in some ways than these ones, there is a recognition. So there is a relatively, and we're not unfortunately explained this by the sources, but we understand that the problem was there, meaning why would there be even this kind of connection, right? It's obvious that the Roman crowning was not random, especially at the hands of the church and the Roman people, right? It wasn't merely a secularistic or politicistic, like, they had to broker that deal, otherwise they could have not controlled the peninsula. No, it doesn't work like that. There had to be a pretty coherently integrated theological understanding of the relation between the church and the empire. I mean, the Roman Empire had been just there up to 300 years prior, so many things changed. There had been, even in the same early Middle Ages, a greater difficulty in coordinating a proper, ecclesiastical homogeneity, etc. But the axis, by the way, between the Franks and Rome had been very old, right? I like to make people reflect on this, that it didn't start really with Charlemagne, right? Already Clovis was in strong contact with the papacy. The Merovingians allowed probably the papacy to evangelize the Anglo-Saxons that were some of their clients. They controlled, they supported the evangelization of Central Europe, right? So it's very fair that in the West, not just among the Franks or the Lombards, you have to add the Anglo-Saxons and other people. So there was a true awareness of the spiritual standard of Rome that, in fact, remained much more orthodox than Constantinople throughout all the vicissitudes of sort of Eastern heresies of that the Byzantines backed for utilitarian reasons that brought them, in any case, to lose those very provinces that they were humiliating theology in order to try to maintain, right? So, but in this sense, there is a deep difference at this point in history, as some sort of mere subjection of the church to the emperor. First of all, in that sense, even though there had been attempts at priestly takeover in different cultures, right? We've seen them even in the Achaemenid Empire. There are occasional mechanisms that seem to indeed suggest like the presence of a more contemplative force that, in the sense, does not quite enact itself, fully actualizes itself as warriors did, and that were to be more of auxiliary relevance than the proper leaders, etc. But the proper concept had also been that the fact that there had to be a single ruler that was the same Christ on earth. This was something actually living in Byzantine tradition, but as we've seen, not really matching the level of ecclesiastical vitality, and therefore also priestly push and sort of infusion in that same imperial power, right? You see this lost in the mists of tradition. For example, ancient Nordic rulers had a sacral kingship tied to fertility and victory at the same. So you have both the Vannic and probably the Apollonian elements controlled by both. This is completely natural in a plenitude of divine archetype, right? And it's not like, again, that this had, if you fully succeed in this, you're God, and so you solve the problem for everybody. This was not the case. It was always a social contract that regulated these powers. The Chinese sovereign, we've seen this in a dedicated video, received mandate directly from heaven through the Tian concept maintaining cosmic harmony, which is also actually very Indo-European at the same time, just to prove that there was a universal belief at the core of this. The Japanese emperor accomplished enthronement through personal spiritual contact with kami, absent any officiating clergy in the daijo-sai rite. And even the Inca solar dominators who claimed descent from Inti, the sun god ruling as living deities, were, at least in theory, devoid of any compromise with the lower priestly estate, which, if you think about it, throughout the Middle Ages is always comes, after all, in the quote-unquote pyramid that is so loaded in it. It was still a hierarchy, like after the king, after the emperor, right? So the Pope, as such, was the spiritual emperor, so to say. And this, if you think about it theologically, could not but result into the bitter struggle between papacy and empire, not in a merely sort of secular sense, but in the sense that the ultimate asymptotic tendency toward divinity could not be simultaneously of two. And so there is this struggle, there is this conflictuality, but at the same time, none of the two, to prove the fact that traditional unity prevailed in the mindset of our forefathers, never denied the function, purpose, and necessity of each other. They never said the empire should not exist, or and the papacy should rule sovereign everywhere. In theory, like could even happen, right, in their minds, but they never went as far as saying, also the papacy must not exist, right? It was mostly a matter of repartition of specific sphere of influence. It mostly ended up in something more, as it was also historically instantiated, like an emperor that had more of a actual military power, and a pope that fundamentally directed matters from a level of spiritual hegemony, of moral regulation, right? And this was the inherent reason of why these also the respective estates existed to begin with. The clergy, the knights. Sometimes they could be the same people. Look at the monastic military order. So again, in this sense, this is a complex idea, because as we explained before, this was not a simple quote-unquote society anymore, to the degree, again, that the world had decayed and split into these major universal authorities. But when you learn to understand this in a modern, far away from a modern and secular way, you realize how actually coherent, necessary, and always in tandem these authorities worked, because they understood much better how these were to work to the end of a unity, not to the end of sort of hampering one another, right? And so, especially among the mystical fascists, if you look at Evola, if you look at especially those who push hard the sense that the church was something merely sort of feminine, right? And in this sense, maternal. I would like to stress again that the Lord is the Lord. In this sense, the church is archetypally to be meant as a spouse, and in sense also as a mother of the faithful, and a daughter also for those who had to protect her and everything. But priesthood was male, all right? In Catholic tradition, it's not to say, okay, well, this is a feministic, communistic cult, right? Where we put at the center the female principle, and no men are allowed, and there isn't a dignity to be maintained. So it's kind of incredibly if you understand also what the purpose of individual priests was, to maintain that spiritual standard, to seek essentially an ascetic path of spiritual fundamentalism, capable of sort of for the rest of the world to access a higher dimension, not differently from the ones that the warriors were trying to do toward their own path. And so merging the resulting power earned in the process into the sake of a unitary divine endeavor, it's on a truly imperial Catholic one, you realize that there is no problem. Like the idea that the church would stand as a sacerdotal case, at least the church, the clergy, in maternal yoni-like relation to the warrior regal principle, is fundamentally wrong. Like the regal type surely appeared as the masculine force that surpasses, individuates, masters, and rules triumphantly the spiritual force conceived as mother and female. In this sense, the church was more distant from that kind of imperial waging and the profession of arms, no doubt. But in this sense, it could not exist without that element. It could not exist without reinvigorating the mother, like the tree of life, and to maintain that relation, just like in the Golden Bow, in order to remain the king, to maintain that kingship. This is not a Christian tale. This is something lost in the mists of classical antiquity, and it's in the European bedrocks. So it means something. It's there in the Aeneid. It's there in the higher sense of accessibility of heaven, as we've seen also in Virgil's fourth eclogue, right? And so it's more the instantiation of, in fact, a truly virginal, purely transfigured woman than a feministic Pelagian idea of a mother that clashes. It doesn't make any sense. In Christianity, the center is Christ, right? And it couldn't be, indeed, without the Theotokos, without the Virgin. But it is to the extent in which that Virgin is successfully transfigured by the victory of the Lord, right? And so it's not antithetic. It's a deeply complementary and compenetrated concept. This compenetrating aspect is truly there when the Saint Pontiffs venerated the emperors, right? For example, when in the investiture by the Pope, which in and of itself tells you how this function, to how mutual interdependent it was, the king assumed rather than merely receive power held in custody by the priesthood. His virile and warrior quality transposed itself to a higher plane, making him axis or pole of the sacred force, as far as at least a temporal domain was concerned, right? The spiritual one owed to the whole universe, and as such, you could even make the case that since, again, there was a temporal repartition, again, that the emperor was just to be the earthly, the mortal side of the story. Obviously not, right? As we see that this wasn't the case for him, why should we consider merely like a maternal force in the church that has to be subject and not sort of being actively participating to indeed what the master in the hierarchy has allowed her to exist? Without the emperor, the church cannot flourish, as a matter of fact, because the emperor owes his power to divine grace, and so only in accordance with God can and will the emperor take over the world and rule over the church, but also in a very Frankish sense, we've seen it last time, not by imposition, but by mere alignment with divine order. And so the church is actually fully into this. They never saw this as an impediment in that regard. The problem arose where both parties, as obviously meant by humans, so to say, in the respective offices, came short of something. In fact, that's why, as I was saying before, the two authorities would never disconfess one another, but they were just basically in case of struggling very humanly over various defiance and other conflicts that could arise in this continuous and necessary struggle. By the way, we explained it before, there can't be a powerful empire without an inner muscle, right? It exercises itself with these two forces counterbalancing each other, right? It's the same principle of checks and balance, but this is something that most people in the world do not understand because they're not able to wield the empire to begin with. And so the consecrating priest must venerate the king as well, who owes, for example, in Vedic tradition, the Brahmana only the respect due to a mother, which is sort of not simply only, right? As he is actually begotten by the mother as well in all this theology. And you know actually that, if as we've seen very often in the European theology and more, the divine is born properly from the abyss, from the deepest of the womb, and it could not be otherwise for the most feminine principle, where in that sense any Apollonian light was shut. And that's why he truly wins in a comprehensive sense and manages to transfigure the mother herself, right? So this aspect is so obvious that it compenetrates the entirety of the two universal powers bond and relations. It's really a maternal bond that the emperor has, right? And he is able to fully transfigure this only in the moment in which he becomes divine. That is to say, when at that point everything is back into God, and so there aren't even ideally these divisions, but also, and obviously, and this is true also for the transfiguration in the flesh, because still also that motherly element has been successfully transfigured. So again, the constant counterposition of papacy and empire should never be understood in a dichotomically oppositive sense, if not within the unity that, in fact, Western civilization displayed at this point in history. It's not like Western civilization at this point was saying, okay, well, there is a part of Europe that is with the Pope and another with the Empire. I mean, this technically happens along a political alignment whenever, again, there was a problem arising, but not because, again, the system was saying, okay, no, we were from the papal side as, properly of the papacy, and outside of here there is the empire. None of this ever existed. It was completely nonsensical, and in fact does not belong to any historical reality either, right? So in the Manavadharma Shastra, the ancient Indian law code attributed to Manu, compiling dharma across varnas and ashramas, emphasizing varna duties with detailed rules of kingship, justice, and cosmology, though Brahman primacy is defended, the Brahmana is likened to water and stone, the Kshatriya to fire and iron instead. And the two are mutually necessary, with Kshatriyas as the summit of the system of laws protecting the realm and upholding order. This is actually a beautiful mirror of what we just stated from the Vedic tradition, right? Here we have, as you know, in the Vedic world, the Brahmana, the priesthood, is able to take over. It actually comes first. The priesthood in India is the first estate, right? And the warriors come second. However, obviously enough, the sacred texts couldn't but show, first of all, this relic of the idea that the Brahmana are actually part of a chthonic dimension, water and stone, right? Remember also in this sense, the Merovingians are born out of a sea cow, Merovec, meaning literally that. And so the myth of this chthonic demon that emerges, but evolving into an Apollonian ruler of the world in the fate and providence of the same Merovingian blood, right? While the Kshatriya master fire and iron, that, as we've seen also in some videos about the mythology of metallurgy in ancient Eurasian tradition, is truly the key to a knightly and military wisdom, right, and capacity that are meant to be ruling the world. This is exactly the same idea of how or why, I don't know, under Ambrose of Milan, there is a full Christianization of the army as well. The idea that fully at that point in history, with the Christianization of the empire officially, as opposed just to freedom of cult under Constantine, the Roman Empire becomes Christian, fighting under the cross, because Christianity, and so the highest, the church itself blesses the victory of the Roman army in arms, right? So recognizing that obviously unsitting the sword is a human limit due to original sin, saints win, as we've seen also in the video about St. Martin of Tours, so without unsitting the sword, right? So by sheer metaphysical power and imperium manifesting as in Christ as winning the world entire. We've seen this actually happening before the Christian religion was a licit cult in the empire, and people misunderstand the story deeply. First, they think that at some point the Romans just persecuted the Christians or hated them, wanted them. This is not what happened. Like, Christianity was there together with many other cults in the empire, and only when there were issues arising from the lack of sacrifice to the earthly authority as a divine one from a Christian side, problems arose ad personam, right? Also, persecutions later were carried out very discretionally across the provinces, regardless also of the imperial edicts. And in fact, there weren't, most of the times, Christians lived peacefully in the empire. And the other thing, we tend to underrepresent how normal it was to be Christian in the army, for example, or how many noblemen became Christians actually from the early centuries of Christianity, not much just the later ones, of course. So this perfectly fit the obvious realization that the Roman Empire, as an ecumenic empire and as the empire blessed by God, where Christ had been born in a Christian perspective, was providentially and evangelically the empire to support. Like, there are explicit I made a video about probably Christians blessing the Roman Empire and its victory in arms. This is very explicit in sort of Christian apologetics in a moment in which they were also criticizing the empire for not being Christian, but they weren't saying, okay, we want to destroy you, we want to fight against you. They were saying, you're doing everything well, become Christian as well, everything's going to go fine. We are actually backing you, right? Fighting against the barbarians, maintaining ecumenic order. This is notorious, and it's somehow weird that nobody sort of talks about this. Just for telling you that while in a modern secular lens we understand as Christianity is something different from, incompatible from the empire, different people, etc., this was just one of the many Catholic ways to God that existed and that eventually successfully prevailed, also for a reason, by the way, in a people that fully understood the problem of sin, of mortality, of the limits at that point of an ecumenic empire that had to achieve heaven and somehow touched it for a moment under Augustus and somehow started declining, according to prophecy, by the way, in the various scanning of the eras, even regardless of Rome, when this had been formulated, and eventually declining in the Fourth Age. And this was known to every people, by the way. So this silly division in sort of wanting to accept to wait, also the church and the empire from one another as if they had not been part of a traditional unity, is sacrilegious and anti-historical to begin with. After Charlemagne's acclamation as Augustus crowned by God, by the way, great and peaceful emperor of the Romans in imperial titles that evoked continuity with Augustus and Constantine, the Pope prostrated, as we were saying before, himself before him according to ancient imperial rite. This had already been a thing, not just in the Byzantine Empire, but in the previous Christian Roman Empire in the West, and it was continuing simply along the same model, right? And so the Pope that actually crowns the emperor and allows also for the Romanization of his authority is the same one who recognizes truly that imperial power. Otherwise, it would have been devoid of sense. You had to give something to the other side, right? You had to, this not just politically, but metaphysically. Like, why were you even recognizing him as the supreme spiritual authority, as ecumenic ruler, if he did not partake divinity by a degree, and to the degree, in fact, that was meant to control the world? This is incredibly important. If you think about this, and this was true since the beginning of the church, at least when it was legalized and could do things in the open, ecclesiastical councils were convoked, authorized, and presided over by the prince, to whom bishops submitted conclusions on faith and doctrine for imperial correction and wisdom to supply what was lacking or rectified what stood against reason. Admittedly, in traditional law, this is what you see in common law, for example, there's the idea of a people having essentially a law given by God, and the sovereign can actually infringe upon it. And so mostly the sovereign is to uphold this law through a regimen of some sort, and so basically respecting the customs of his own subjects that in turn legitimize him. This is actually the same thing that happens with the church. Remember, there is a civil law and a canonical law throughout the Middle Ages and in Christian history. But importantly enough, there is a true imperial patronage of these activities. Again, the ecumenic councils couldn't but occur under the auspices of the emperor and of the local lay representatives, whoever they were. They could be also kings, counts, princes of various sort. And they were the obvious reflection of the constant tandem between royal and ecclesiastical authority, right? They couldn't operate separately. It did not make any sense. the emperor will come to actually create a new law, understood as sort of a providential prerogative, only in sort of very exceptional circumstances, when, especially in the practice of law, there was a gap that needed to be filled by somebody who made the new law. This is mostly peaking in southern Italy under the Normans, but in particular Frederick II. You have the Melfi constitutions. I made some videos about those, and they're a bit of an exception that in that case shows not just an important power concentration in the Kingdom of Sicily, but also the Holy Roman Imperial power in the flesh of the Hohenstaufen, that were also trying to assert their own imperial supremacy over the church in those very years, right? But overall, again, this was an extreme and one of the bitterest, in fact, moments of contrast, or the bitterest, as a matter of fact, between papacy and empire. But again, ex officio, not by institutional opposition, right? Around the year 1000, the Romano-Germanic generations undertook, with increasing rapidity, a process of reassimilation of Christianity in its reformation, truly. This is true from the papal side with the Gregorian reforms that evidently show how power was stepping up from both sides within the wall. And under the clear gaze of Gothic phases, Christianity clarified its substance and became Olympian. There arose the heroic type of Christ. It's also impossible not to notice the Nordicizing character. This remains as a transfigurational feature, right? And literal phenotype, when you look at Western art, right? It's not merely sort of in fact, a phenotypic overlap with Europeans, but something that takes on a completely different transfigurational meaning once you realize that, of course, also the attributes of blondness, as we've seen this since a very long time, not just obviously because of the Indo-European legacy, but the actual characters of divinity attributed to those colors. We've seen that in a truly metaphysical sense, for example, in Roman mythology, in Italic literature. This is something that we will come back, because there is a great debate regarding these things. What kind of traits were attributed properly to divinity, also in a human sense. And you find in this splendid art a heroic Christ that is full of nobility and measure, destined to perpetuate itself as a type in the image of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, emphasizing interior devotion and kingship as well. Because remember that also in Indo-European theology, the Sacred Heart is such as it's from the heart that really small seed, like a grain of barley, as the smallest point, like in the abyss, in the innards, is to as this also the seed of birthing life in a spiritual sense, capable of overwhelming the universe and therefore making man God himself. That's what the concept of the Sacred Heart of Jesus actually stems from in Christian tradition. Beyond the Pauline Augustinian negation of the world, there flowered again the notion of the visible order, symbol of the invisible as well, right? This depends on the tempers of the time. It's obvious that there are sort of different outlooks. Of course, St. Paul and Augustine were unsurprisingly resumed by Luther in many ways, obviously in a heretical sense, but because, of course, different apostles, fathers of the church, emphasize different aspects of the Christian message and make incredibly strong linguistic choices as well, and consequently theological ones. Against Augustine's passionate negation of the Roman Empire as the work of Cain and the Civitas Diaboli stood the restoration of an empire at once Roman and sacred. Right, Augustine was not criticizing the Roman Empire as the Ecumenic Empire, was criticizing it as failing at fulfilling the mandate that had been called to perform. And so it's obvious that, for somebody who died, during a siege or a city besieged by the Vandals, obviously the world is going to look a bit grimmer, and the broader circumstances were somehow, everything is somehow darker as such. And there are, in fact, these vibes that if you look at the Mediterranean world, right, and the broader and its surroundings, so basically the entirety of the world, by the Common Era, practically everybody all peoples have stopped thinking that they could save themselves by themselves, or at least they obviously always thought, just like the Christians with theosis, that is a pretty explicit doctrine, that you can't save yourself by yourself, meaning that if you are truly Christo-mimetically divine, you can save yourself in that sense through Christ, but because you are kind of Christ, and so the same God, right? This is the same idea, with Mithraism. It's not like Mithras had simply saved everybody. You had to carry out the thing yourself, and Christ actually says the same thing. So the sense of a world that by that point had lost the plot, right, and lived in a sense of incumbent threat and danger, even perceived at the time of Christ, obviously, where even before the secular peak of the empire, technically, whether you look at it under Trajan, territorially speaking, or the Antonites in the life quality, sort of material affluence, and so on, you realize that the disease of abundance, right, having reached the peak, like things start to decline, is there. There is something that needs to be fixed and to be restored in a spiritual sense. It's the same Buddha with the Kshatriya class, right? They had failed to, with what we've seen, they had even been surpassed by priesthood. So in this sense, the church in the West performs a similar role and is prophetic in this regard. We've seen in Hippolytus, for example, the prophecy in the decline of the Eastern churches, interestingly enough, in favor of Rome, if you think about it as well, because this is exactly what would eventually happen in Mediterranean European history. And you have in this sense, a vibe that has been exploited, as we were saying before, also by the critics of Christianity, especially in a 20th century perspective, and so one that hardly could recover actually the fully traditional meaning of it all and got confused regarding different aspects of the same, unfortunately, with enormous disasters, as we've seen. There is a vibe that sort of affects the empire itself, that surely mirrors its own fragility, that opens to this quote-unquote dark ages and the shrinking of the empire. So when you look at the relics of the empire, what remains of it, these relics are still living, just like the meaning of actual relics, bodily relics, was understood in antiquity, like in these traditional times. And it's from this point that gradually, also here we're speaking from a Western perspective, the Latin-Germanic civilization manages to reactivate this heavenly power, right? In the time of St. Paul, for example, there had been a cosmopolitan pacifism embraced by especially some more radical sects of Christianity, right? Christianity had lots of issues, and what is extremely fascinating in this sense is how it managed to uphold orthodoxy in the first centuries of the empire, and how early evangelic tradition really is. I mean, the Gospels are like, there is no other parallel in the history of religions as far as by time and place, relatively to time and place, having this coherent, innerly coherent body doctrine that was successfully preserved and matches with pretty much anything that we understand from the same religion and the previous ones, especially in the of Judean legacy, and that to make sense in that broader ecumenic fashion that we are actually describing, right? We wish we had this for practically any other religion. This was the religion of the book. It was due to Christianity that books proper began to spread. Like before, admittedly, there were scrolls, but it's the individual approach to the Bible that brings properly to the codicological form of the book as we know it. Scrolls had other functions, including being read in public, read for others, and so on. This is just a little side note. But it's important to stress that, in fact, that sort of rebellism, or some people have associated Christianity with some sort of crippling socialism. When Christianity takes over, does it seem to you that it's something socialistic or feministic or whatever? Actually, they went on suppressing all those kind of Chthonic superstitions of matrifocal nature that, in theory, should have been, according to this kind of misinterpretation of Christianity, the center of Christianity itself. This is not the case. Christianity was not Hellenistic, feministic cult like the one of sacred prostitution of Aphrodisias. Like, there were some much more conservative standards in Christianity, and here I'm just stating the obvious for the sake of sort of provocation, right? Food for thought. And when you look at those, also that fake accusation of pacifism, well, you realize that medieval civilization fully embraces the myth and the living way that had remained unaltered in this sense of holy war, most famously among others, because again, this is eventually written down, but it was fully lived again throughout all this period in the Bernardine Laus Nove Militiae. And so obviously Saint Bernard of Clairvaux's 12th century treatise in praise of the new knighthood, in fact praising the Templars as ascetic warriors combining monastic discipline with martial prowess against a backdrop of Cistercian reform and Second Crusade enthusiasm. If you're interested, I also made a video about not just the theology of Crusades, but specifically the specific texts of the era, particularly between the First and the Second Crusade, describing just war. And, you know, that at this point, fundamentally, we're still completely soaked into Neoplatonism. And so that sort of a monatistic concept of the one. Later, the Templars will have some problem, to say the least, with the church because of certain practices that were cultivated within it that were eventually misrepresented at the same trial against the Templars that the church itself did not particularly like, as you know, being carried out in France for different reasons. There were many clergymen who said that this is nonsense, and so proving yet again that the sort of the knightly way, the iron and fire way that we've seen from the Vedic tradition was fully coherent, would always remain coherent with European aristocracy, knighthood, and more. I also made that video about William Marshall observed toward the end of his life that the church did not understand the Templar order. And this is a very interesting insight. In fact, that was broadly meant, right? But that shows how relatively late in time, still the idea, in fact, of an imperial power, probably resurrecting from the embers of the previous idea of this nobility as freedom, and so in that sense, an unchecked force of those who bore the sword was looked upon with relative suspicion by the church. Consider this happened at the time of sort of the papal monarchy, so where the popes had fought and won their own autonomy from the empire in arms and had risk probably to be brought under. And so obviously the Guelphism that developed in the wake of that was indeed sort of pushing towards a specific direction that looked at the church as a main pole of attraction. This is what, in fact, mostly causes problems down the line. But again, We see it in the Middle Ages and even later on without actually breaking from one another. It could be a distancing, as it happened at the time of Ludwig of Wittelsbach during, probably like before the arrival of the storm of the Black Death of the mid-14th century crisis and everything, where the both universal authorities were actually losing temporal power, right? And so there is the rise of national monarchies, and so there is a further fragmentation of the ecumenic landscape, also within Christendom. But at the same time, much is also preserved. You have traditional kingship preserving all along attributes of esoteric stability linked to the Olympian and to an interior positive peace, not profane exterior peace, but perfection of activity, inseparable from the triumphal element, testifying to the supernatural. At some point, you have the idea of the unmoved mover. Think about the Wei Wu Wei in the Taoist tradition. That remains always there. The idea that you had to be hieratic, especially as a leader, as an elderly, understood in a spiritual sense. And so the leader, the war band, and the hierarchical phase that was partially priestly, right? In the sense that, again, if you were to be a sacred ruler, because you had, as we said before, is especially expressed in the French royal tradition, but you find it also in the Holy Roman Empire, the fact that you had to be immobile in public. Philip IV, that again called himself a Caesar just as much as Boniface VIII did, was apparently never seen smiling in his life. We do know actually through his private documents, etc., that he had a particularly strong love for his wife, for his brother, that he was obviously living in that role in a time that was the peak of medieval civilization that really required of these individuals an extraordinary effort and power, right? So the point and how I see it is that these two powers not just coexist but live entwined in this kind of manifestations that were completely normal at the time. Now we are surprised because in the way they surface, but because we don't seem to have the comparative awareness of how natural these things really were. Like the fact that kings drew ancient power from the supreme God and receiving victory from his hands as lighthouses of peace in the storm. This is something really normal, still in a medieval mentality, because these men actually brought order. If you enforce a structuralistic lens as a socio-economical interpretation of it, you will never see the miracle that the medieval empire and monarchies really were in this sort of side-by-side development of a European civilization, right? How this properly ignited with new sacred fire and injected properly new substantial vital lymph on so many other countries on the outskirts. Look at what happened to Spain, what happened to the Western Slavs, what happened in that also to the Scandinavians, to southern Italy. Like you have in the post-Carolingian world, like this consolidation of these ideas of this Latin-Germanic syncresis, of this imperial and ecclesiastical authorities cooperating, and you have the Crusades, and you have the expansion, the overflowing outside of this. How can we avoid to see it in a unitary sense? Victory or defeat in battle was read as a sign from above of justice or injustice, right? Battles such as Fontenoy in 841, the bloody Carolingian civil war clash near Auxerre in modern France, where the forces of Lothar, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald fought with massive casualties. It's my birthday, it's the same day, by the way, among Frankish warriors, and the outcome was interpreted as divine judgment determining the division of the empire. And were conceived as judgments of God, fought under norms that forbade the victor from taking booty or exploiting success strategically while requiring equal care for the wounded and fallen. It's a very sort of chivalric ethos. I was thinking just at the later Battle of Fontenoy, where actually there were these episodes of chivalry where you had no, that wasn't Fontenoy actually, but let's say if you look still at the 18th century, you would have prisoners, wounded prisoners, taken with you in your own tent as you were wounded, and you would chivalrously offer the services of your own personal doctor to cure this other nobleman that had fought against you, but you still saw the nobility of. Again, the Franks has this idea, as we've seen also in the Chanson de Geste, that the enemy opponent is not to be destroyed, he is to be tamed and brought from your side. Is incredibly enormous sensitivity towards the potential, the redeeming character of mankind, like the fact that this sacrifice is properly tested in the flesh, and that the spirit of God is properly incarnating in these figures. So when you look at also the various clan-entry mechanism, we just recently made a video about Carolingian heavy cavalrymen for that matter, you realize that everything was aiming at reconstituting a unitary wall. That's what war is fundamentally about. That's the entire Imperial Catholic traditional point, making everything into one. And only those who can garner more power and gain, in the sense, more consensus, the decisive moral majority of the system, can come closer to God in the process. And the example of Fontenoy is fascinating because, as I often point out, like if you study Carolingian military history, tactical details are practically non-existent, right? We can't reconstruct almost any Carolingian battle from a tactical standpoint. And Fontenoy was massive, was not just very bloody, but also like just very big, right? And you have Nithard, it was grandson of Charlemagne, who was an abbot, and is there are only two sources. One is him, and these abbots were abbots because they had abbot commendations, but they lived a knightly lifestyle. This guy would be killed in Aquitaine during a Viking raid, as a matter of fact. As an abbot, he was literate to the point he wrote this story, and he actually talks exactly in these higher spiritual terms, like God decided, right, from whose side the probably victory had to be, right, and this was again out of virtue and out of sort of imperial accomplishment. At the same time, just for telling you how compenetrated also the idea of the clergyman and the warrior really are. Like this guy is an abbot and a knight, right, that has imperial blood, by the way, and the actually more in-depth source on the Battle of Fontenoy is more detailed and sort of talking more about the battle as such and sort of giving more information, is Agnellus of Ravenna, that was actually an Italian clergyman who actually was more knowledgeable, or at least more knowledgeable, not than Nithard, obviously, but of the various historians that sort of wrote down and that probably were not necessarily better informed. Naturally, Ravenna was very central at some point. It even competed with Rome. What happened in the empire was known. And Agnellus, as a clergyman, writes about this battle in more military terms, and we know, in fact, more from his account than the one of Nithard that had literally participated in the battle. So it's something really eye-opening regarding the compenetration of this ecclesiastical and warlike dimension as well, right? And here we could easily descend. I want to check, excuse me a second, like what kind of time we've made here, because if it is over 2 hours, as at this point, this thing's gone, it's better to stop it here so we'll have more also for other videos in general. I don't pretend you to watch entirely these very long videos, even though they are, in that sense, relevant. Okay, we just surpassed 2 hours. We can maybe just talk about a little new thing, such as the fact that through legions, for example, such as the combat of Roland and Farragus, the Middle Ages submitted even the criterion of truer fate to trial by arms. This had already been a point, like in all tribal cultures, and that the Germans somehow were injected, in part because, again, they were primitive, their societies were mostly sort of working that way. That's definitely an indicator of scarce level of power at the top, all right? And in fact, you have in Germanic culture in general, like before, like the Germans the Germanics settled in the Roman lands, tendentially successful check of especially a royal rise, right? The first Germanic kings, at least of entire national peoples, so to say, are effectively Roman creations. If you look at the Goths, right? Alaric, and these were essentially the leaders of the provincial Roman army of Foederati, paid with the annona and compacted as co-opted, also brought up at court like in an imperial Roman context, right? This had already been happening for quite a while. So we've seen also in the video about the Marcomanni recently. If you look at Marabot, if you look at Armenians, like this had been brought up in the core of Romanity. So we're not talking about unknown peoples out there that, as sometimes we somehow depict Europeans, literally, like in Central, aside from the fact that we know that there were contacts from Northern Southern Europe continuously in the previous millennia, but let's say the point is literally like, I don't know, the ancients did not travel. It was sort of a more primitive world. They didn't know. They were ignorant. They knew everything practically. The only point is that they knew this stuff so much that they didn't even need to talk about it. The need of being open, of writing down things, it's something that you can easily understand, even in the Roman mentality of Tacitus or Caesar, being just instrumental to very specific political purpose, not because they felt the need to sort of abstract and contemplate about this or that thing. And in their archaic mindset, much more archaic than the Hellenic one at that point, you understand how even actually similar and interested, in fact, in these other peoples they were, because they sort of understood the archetype, right? The Romans, as you know, have a tendentially, if not entirely positive, at least an ambivalent understanding of the goals of the Germans, right? All things we will come back on. But the point being also, still checking the time here, that when the Germanics enter the Roman lands, these places are also have become more unstable than under the Pax Romana. And so there is, as we said before, at least a foundational legal principle that at some point the same Romano-Germanic kings tend to suppress, namely the one of sort of individual justice, like of the idea of simply settling matters privately, personally, without a higher authority needing to intervene if not properly addressed for specific cases of injustice. As you understand, it was an imperfect system, but the idea that the stronger and those who had, in the sense, divine power could affirm a greater right, and it was never just like individually, it was more like their own clans and how these would sort of equilibrate with one another and within themselves, was prevalent, because the inherent Germanic legal principle that underpinned this, as we know, as eventually in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, the Germanic laws were written down, was the idea that this derived from the metus hostilis in the Barbaricum, that if there was a feud, an unsettled feud within the clan, within the tribe, depending on the scale here we're discussing, the system was undermined, was politically split and weak, and therefore the enemy would take advantage of that from the outside and would crush your people. All right, so this was the underlying principle behind this, and it evolves eventually towards a more aristocratic knightly dimension. As in the early Middle Ages, these peoples again settle down, there is a greater social certification, and from a Frankish perspective, there is a great admiration of nobility, and in the sense freedom, but not in an individual sense anymore, or at least an every guy. Those who were freemen actually always belonged to different categories, as you see also from the laws of recruitment of these peoples, right? You were not, if you look at Vergil, you know that this properly attributed different value to people that could be properly quantified, so that you killed somebody, you paid a lot, like say tens of solidi, but still it depended on who they were, and this varied, and it was assessed normally and originally in a sort of private contractual sense. Eventually these kingdoms need to properly legislate in a way that says, okay, this should be more standardized on the basis of classes, of values, whatever. And much of it was still done in very private terms, right? But in this sense, and this is true even during the migration era, even before settling in the Roman lands, the same Germanic society, for the sake of migration, of, in this sense, military defense and so on, in offense for that matter, had already stratified itself. The nobility had increased in importance together with cavalry. And so people in the lower estates were gradually sort of moved away from positions of power, at least in capacity of collectively influencing this. This is still kind of happened, right? So don't underestimate the freshness of these peoples, the level of militarization. There were some peoples who were more or less stratified. I always bring up the example of the Longobards and the Gepids. We see the Longobards, for example, having in their graves in Pannonia a much more evenly distributed amount of wealth in the forms of spatae, in other sort of gear, horses and so on. Whereas the Gepids were also very rich, but they had especially a very rich elite, and most of the rest of the warriors were actually pretty poor from the graves in the Carpathian Basin. And so we understand eventually they were two fairly balanced peoples strategically. There are also the Byzantines, the Avars stepping in sort of different surroundings people, but eventually the Longobards crush the Gepids. And so that makes you think in terms of which model was sort of stronger. In fact, the Longobards in part inject this in Italy in a way that was not injected, for example, by the Franks in Gaul. Right? The Franks were actually similar in that sense, but Clovis properly decapitated all the opponents out there. He wiped out sort of a concurrent Frankish royalty. Because they were all petty kings originally. Clovis himself, like being king of Tournai, etc., he decapitates that elite and he rules as his own elite, as his own family. So he establishes a hyper-monarchic dynastic system. Whereas the Longobards blended much better with the Roman civility that had already characterized the Ostrogothic kingdom. And they have, in fact, an incredibly advanced, urbanized, civilized, literate kingdom that, however, is also a bit less martial. It develops a bit less of a professional elite quantitatively because the models were similar across Europe, also among the Franks. And so you have these differences that eventually complement one another. But for telling you how at that point, like, it was mostly nobility in arms, among the Franks in particular, they're the ones that eventually reinformed this whole Western world, towards the nobility of the horseman, of the cavalryman, he who was a true knight and therefore was seen as a true hero, on the shoulders of which a large part of the population rested, right? And so there's a much more pushed, chivalric, knightly equestrian model, as we're saying also in an heroic sense. Think about, again, what we said before about St. George, etc. And the parallelism with Siegfried, this story is lived probably in the veins of these people, right? It would have been sort of absolutely surprised by the radical level of compenetrations at the time of Charlemagne, with his obsession for King David, and god lords of battle descending to the fray with them, and the Nibelungenlied, right? In all the Germanic epos, in all the memory, but what is, I don't know what we would collectively pay to just know how Charlemagne would actually know history, or at least had been told about history at some point, through all these legends and backgrounds, and not just the written part of it. So it's something unbelievable to think, to discern in their metaphysical worldview of the Midgard and the order that had to be established on the earth. So in this order, myth, legend, and saga possess superior validity because they were fundamentally theological, metaphysical texts and oral traditions over our own, instead, modern secular, mere historical material, right? In fact, if you really, this is what I always say about these people, you have to, in the absence of more explicit documents, but even and always next to them, besides them, always to search for the indirect indicators. Like the fact that they didn't write, they weren't literate, this is particularly true for the Frankish elite, doesn't mean that they didn't carry like a massive treasure of knowledge. True, it's very different in scale, in purpose, like the educational, cultural development of, say, Rome and the Mediterranean. And that's what Charlemagne will overwhelmingly try to import north of the Alps, also for understanding that proper blend of synchrosis between tradition and innovation is the key to the empire. There would have not been a Carolingian empire without that, right? But in this sense, the sagas of Charlemagne actually reveal the sense of the Frankish king way more than, say, positive chronicles, right? When you try to make sense of the history of it, but you are not able to look at the myth, at the symbol, at the archetype contained shrined in literature. I have some videos, for example, on the paladins of Charlemagne, and everybody would immediately tell you in today's world, oh, well, but it's just legions, this is not history. What's the point of saying that? First of all, like, everybody knows that. Like, what's the difference? But still, isn't it obvious that that massive and incredibly long-living amount of epic knowledge derived from the obvious sort of neurocognitive wiring of a 9th century Carolingian warrior, right? It's obvious that they're often passing as, chivalry was actually created in the 12th century. No, right? These things existed from millennia. The fact that they were first written down is not like they were first born, right? That's how, skepticists, materialists, they try to trick you by telling you, but if there is no evidence, you can't actually say that that's the thing. That's the dumbest, most anti-scientific and immoral thing you can say, right? And that's why I also want to get more a bit into the German folklore, especially like for what we can gather there mixed with the imperial legacy. Looking at the legions of Charlemagne, Frederick I and Frederick II, as we've seen in an entire video, vanishing into the mountain to re-manifest, expressing the mysterious seat of the king of the world and supreme center at the same time, right? We've seen that surviving the same number of coils around the table of the sleeping sovereign in also the tradition of certain monastic military orders. We talked about that for the Order of the Dragon in 15th century Hungary. So it's really endless in this sense. It doesn't end there. It's in the veins of our culture, right? And that's why we will surely look more and better at all this, because today we covered a fair amount. I don't know if next time, I doubt that we're simply going to finish this. We could even do something slightly more now, but it's not necessary. Like, there is very good food for thought, and I'm particularly glad that we managed to talk about this, because we need to have these conversations. Like the West, Europe, our traditional past is alive, right, for us to have this conversation. So it's something that we really must be extremely aware of and not to give up on at all. Because there you can, and you understand how this can be read from anywhere. Some of you told me, but why do I have to learn history? Because you're a freaking modern person. It's useless that you flatter yourself in thinking that being a lesser person is normal. It's not normal. It's not normal to the eyes of your ancestors. It's incredibly dumb. Like most of quote-unquote traditionalism or conservatism, even less, that you see online, is a complete pile of garbage. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Imperial Catholic tradition. It's not history. It's not theology. It's not metaphysics. It's just lesser people on X wasting their lives writing things that they don't even understand. Right? So be extremely aware of that, because you have to enact this in your own life as well, in a way or another. We all have different predispositions, but doesn't mean that the end is not the same, right? And you can also gnostically separate different aspects of this all, right? But again, glad to have covered this. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.